Okay, you go.
Okay, well, let's start by thinking a bit about mentoring and considering kind of what it is and what it does and how you can kind of work with the idea of mentoring. Mentoring has been linked to the whole idea of learning and development. So mentoring's kind of a learning relationship between two people. And what that means is both people learn. And it's a question of mentors saying, well, what is it I might learn? And it seems quite important that if you're going into mentoring, that you're aware that you probably have things that you might learn as a mentor. And people who are aware of their own learning make good mentors, because it means they're open to listen to other people and pay attention to them. So what might you do? Well, think about your experiences, think about your successes, thinking about things that haven't quite gone as well as you thought they would. Think about some of your disappointments and how you dealt with them, because all that kind of richness of your experience becomes very useful in the mentoring process. What is really key in terms of mentoring is, first of all, to spend a good amount of time getting to know the person. Just having a conversation about who they are, who you are, and where you come from, what you do, what you're interested in, because that kind of chemistry meeting, as I call it, is really quite important, because it lays a core foundation for the beginning. It's also important to establish between the two of you some kind of set of ground rules or expectations between you. So what is it do you expect as a mentor, and what is it your mentee is expecting? And I really urge you to have that conversation very early on in your relationship, so that you start to get an idea about what it's all about. You need to talk about things like confidentiality, for example. What does that mean? How many people need to know that you're involved in the mentoring relationship? What is it they need to know? What is it they don't need to know? It's also important to think about how often you meet, where you meet, for how long. Do you meet in an office? Do you meet in Starbucks over coffee? Do you go for a walk? Do you have lunch? What kind of situations do you think are appropriate for you to meet in? That's pretty important. Also thinking about what happens if you can't make your appointment? What are the arrangements for that? Also thinking about who contacts who outside of the mentoring relationship. And certainly I would suggest that it's your protege or your mentee, as we say in the UK, is the person that needs to be driving that sort of process and asking for meetings. Do you put meetings in advance in your diary? Or do you just say, oh, come and chat to me anytime? What I'd say about that is that if you're running on a come and chat to me anytime, it's my experience that sometimes those relationships just kind of fall apart. So often a good idea to put things in the diary and make arrangements and come to agreements. It's also important to think about what kinds of things you want to talk about in mentoring, because sometimes mentoring can go quite deep. It can sometimes be quite personal. So how prepared are you for that kind of discussion, and what do you think your protege might want to add to that discussion? It's also important to think about what do you expect your protege to do as a result of mentoring, and what do they expect you to do? I mean, do they expect you to go and fix things for them, speak to their bosses, speak to their colleagues, rescue them? Or do you expect them to stand on their own 2 feet, make their own decisions? Because core to mentoring is enabling somebody to stand on their own 2 feet, make their own decisions, and move forward from that position. So really important to have a conversation about the ground rules of the relationship. Very key, right at the start. And it's also important that you regularly review those ground rules. You go back to them over and over again and you talk about them. Because some very interesting research on mentoring suggested that what contributes to the success of mentoring is the ability of both parties to give and receive feedback about the relationship. And if you haven't established any kind of ground rules, if you haven't talked about any of your expectations either way, you haven't really got anything to give and receive feedback on. So really important that you do that. Also, what is really key in mentoring as a mentor is your ability to listen. Listening is absolutely central to the whole business of mentoring. And it's a lot harder than you would think. And I'm sure that Marcia will work with you on some of the listening skills that are there, because listening is crucial to the whole process. The second most important part of the process is asking questions. And it's a good idea to try to work on asking reflective questions or asking open questions rather than closed questions. But try not to get too hung up on the idea of trying to create a great question, because if you're hung up on trying to create a great question, you might stop listening because you're too busy thinking of the question. And from my experience, a good protege will turn any question that you ask them into what it is they want to talk about. So try to relax about your questioning. That's quite important. One of the things that I try to encourage people to do also is to try to follow a process, and I call this the three-stage process. And the three-stage process, first of all, has an exploration phase where you explore the topic and ask lots of questions and discuss it. The next phase is that you develop, the mentee, the protege develops a new understanding of a situation. And the final stage is that you create some kind of action plan as a result. Now, what I think of this process model is that it's a bit like a map. And what a map does is help you to plan a route, help you to work out where you are if you get lost, help you to go back to the beginning and plan a new route. Because what happens with this three-stage process is it often goes backwards and forwards, and you might get to action and think, actually, no, we didn't explore that well enough, so be prepared to go back and explore something again to help your protege to think things through in a way that's appropriate. And then we come to the big question of experience. How do you make use of your experience as a mentor in the mentoring process? Now, what is key is that you try to avoid giving advice. Because, do you know what? Nobody ever took advice at all unless they wanted to. So how can you use your experience? Well, I find that the best way to do that is to say to your protege or your mentee is, I've experienced something similar. Would it be helpful if I shared with you my experience, and then perhaps we can think about what I did, what worked, what didn't work, what went well, what didn't go so well, so that maybe we can learn from my experience, and you don't have to take it as advice, but we may be able to hold it up as a kind of case study and then learn from that, and that's pretty important. It's also important in mentoring, as a final thing before I finish, is to think about how the mentoring relationship is going to come to an end. And it's much better to bring it to a close formally than to just let it drift away. And what that means is, if you have regular reviews of your relationship and regular reviews of your ground rules, at some point you might say, do you think this has done what it needs to do? Do we need to move on? Or would you like to carry on? And then you think about whether or not you're having a soft close or a harder close, because the soft close will be, I tell you what, call me in a month's time and we'll see where we are. Or a harder close would be, well, that's great, see you around. Thanks very much. So that's a bit of an introduction to mentoring with some practical ideas. The best thing to do is get in there and do some, and then reflect on your experiences of mentoring, because that's the best way to learn how to get on with it. Thanks for listening.